Now that you have something from Fenmore and Vance on your wall, maybe people will finally stop wondering what Colton ever saw in you. Colton Whitfield, 40-year-old husband of Orla, said it with the kind of smile that passes for warmth when no one is looking closely enough. He held the framed piece out toward her with both hands, the way a man offers something he believes is beyond the recipient, generous in his own estimation and faintly condescending in everyone else's. Orla Vance Whitfield, 37-year-old wife of Colton Whitfield, accepted it. The Langford Hotel's main ballroom had been dressed for the occasion in ivory and warm gold. Tall candles ran the length of every table. White floral arrangements climbed the columns on both sides of the room, and the chandeliers threw a light that was flattering to everyone and honest about nothing. 200 guests had been invited to mark 10 years of marriage. Colton's colleagues, old university contacts, clients from his financial advisory firm, and the specific category of person who attends events like this not because they care about the couple, but because they care about being seen. Standing beside Colton, close enough that the proximity itself told the room something, was Bryn Salas, 31-year-old senior associate at his firm. She held a champagne flute with the easy confidence of someone who had been preparing for tonight for considerably longer than tonight. Percival Whitfield, 68-year-old father of Colton and Orla's father-in-law, stood near the head table with a glass of red wine and an expression of enormous self-satisfaction. He had mentioned Fenmore and Vance at least 4 times since the evening began, to the property developers at table 6, to the insurance executive near the bar, to a pair of architects Orla privately knew and had deliberately seated at the far end of the room. Percival spoke about the firm the way certain men speak about exclusive memberships they cannot obtain, with the familiarity of someone who wanted proximity to the name to function as the thing itself. Earlier in the evening, Orla had overheard him tell a cluster of guests, "Fenmore and Vance doesn't work with just anyone. There's a lineage there, a standard most people can't meet." She had touched the pendant at her collarbone, an old piece, simple gold, geometric, worn smooth from years of handling, and said nothing. Now holding the framed piece, she was silent for different reasons. The frame contained an architectural sketch on aged paper, pencil lines forming the facade of a private residence, an arched entry, stone coursework, windows arranged against each other with a precision that looked effortless and had required years of study to achieve. Colton had introduced it to the room as an original work by the founding designer of Fenmore and Vance, acquired through a private dealer in Montreal. He had called it a gift that represented, and here his voice carried exactly as far as he intended, real pedigree for once. Several guests laughed softly. Percival clapped. Orla did not move. She examined the piece the way she examined everything she suspected of dishonesty, without announcing the examination. She noted the paper grain. She noted the direction of the pencil shading in the lower quadrant, where the original hand had moved freely from long habit, but this copy had hesitated and corrected. She noted the signature in the bottom right corner. The loop of the V was closed completely. In 12 years of studying the original, she had never seen that loop close. Her mother had been particular about it, in the way artists are particular about the smallest things, because the smallest things are the ones that cannot be faked without knowing them firsthand. She knew because her mother had drawn the original, and because Orla Vance Whitfield was the founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Fenmore and Vance. The firm's ownership had been structured, from its founding, through a private trust bearing her mother's name. The public-facing work, client presentations, press relationships, the name on the industry awards, belonged to Fenmore and Vance's managing director, a respected architect named Clarence Bray, who handled what Orla preferred not to. Orla held the firm's creative direction, strategy, and financial authority from a position of deliberate invisibility. She had built it that way deliberately. Her mother had taught her why. The pendant at Orla's throat had been her mother's. The firm's name contained her mother's. Fenmore and Vance. Vance had been Eloise Vance's surname before marriage, the name she had worked under, the names she had taught under, the name she had died before seeing turned into one of the most sought-after design practices in the country. Eloise had sold handmade pieces and detailed sketches from a rented studio in Montreal and had once told Orla, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while Orla did her homework, "Real work announces itself quietly. Let the work carry your name before you have to." Colton had been told when they married that Orla worked for a design firm. He had not asked what that meant. He had said once, in their first winter together, that he found it charming, her little career. He had returned to his own work. He had not asked the name of the firm until the 3rd year of their marriage, when it came up at a dinner party in a way that made someone at the table go briefly quiet. Colton had turned to Orla and asked whether she had heard of Fenmore and Vance. She had said yes. He had gone back to his dessert. That evening, Orla had understood something about the shape of what she had chosen. She had told herself she would tell him the truth when she felt certain that what he loved was her and not her position. She had waited for that certainty for 7 years. It had not arrived. Instead, there had been the unexplained hotel receipts, the phone turned face down on the dinner table. Every evening, the way Bryn Salas's name began appearing in casual conversation with the particular naturalness of something rehearsed. The way at last year's foundation gala, Colton had moved them both toward his father's table and away from Orla's colleagues, as though, somewhere beneath his confidence, he sensed that her professional world was larger than his and preferred not to be reminded. Stay with this story, because the woman standing in that ballroom, holding a counterfeit copy of her own mother's work, was not at the end of something. She was at the beginning of a very different kind of ending. Dele Owusu, 41-year-old senior executive assistant, and the person who had worked beside Orla for 9 years, without ever being given a reason to doubt her, had placed the private investigator's preliminary report on Orla's desk 6 weeks earlier without being asked. Orla had read it in the car park of Fenmore and Vance's headquarters, engine off, rain running down the windshield in long grey lines. Colton had been photographed at a hotel near the waterfront on 4 separate occasions over 11 weeks. Bryn Salas had been photographed entering and leaving each time. Orla had sat with the report for a long time. Then she had called Ines Marchand. Ines Marchand, 48-year-old corporate and family law attorney, had been Orla's legal counsel since the firm's early years. She knew exactly what Orla had built and what she stood to protect. She had listened to all of it and then set her pen down on her notepad, which was what she did when she was moving from listening into planning. "Don't confront him before the dinner," Ines had said. "Let him show you what he intends. I'll be in that room." The anniversary dinner had been Colton's idea. Unusual enthusiasm, 3 months of planning, the most expensive room in the Langford, a guest list he had assembled himself. Orla had allowed herself, briefly, to believe it meant he wanted to repair something. She had wanted to believe that. The wanting had been its own kind of sorrow. Now she understood the party had never been a reconciliation. She raised her eyes from the framed piece and spoke calmly into the middle of the room, where everyone could hear. "Before I respond," she said, "I'd like to have this authenticated." Someone near the bar made a sound that might have been amusement. Percival lifted a dismissive hand. Colton's smile held, but it had to work harder. "Orla, it's a gift. You don't authenticate a gift." "I'd still like it done." He opened his arms to the guests, the gesture of a man demonstrating patience to a room full of witnesses. "Fine," he said, "if it'll make you feel better about receiving something nice for once." Near the charitable auction display at the far end of the room, a collection of donated artwork benefiting the Toronto Foundation for Housing, for which Franklin Addo, 56-year-old senior provenance specialist and accredited art authentication expert, had been present all evening in a professional capacity. Franklin rose from his chair. "With Mrs. Whitfield's permission," he said, "I can conduct a preliminary examination now. My equipment is already set up for the foundation pieces." That was true, and it was also not the whole truth, in the way that careful preparation is rarely accidental. Franklin had received the private dealer's receipt from Orla 2 days earlier. The receipt had described the piece as original archive work from Fenmore and Vance's founding period, with documentation enclosed. The documentation had used a certificate format the firm had retired in 2014, following an investigation into forged provenance papers that had circulated through Montreal and Ontario private dealers. Franklin had called Orla within 40 minutes of reading the receipt. He had been invited to the Langford not as a guest, but as a professional with a verifiable reason to be there. The charitable auction had provided that reason. Franklin set the frame on a cloth-covered table beside the auction display and put on white cotton gloves. The room, which had not been fully quiet all evening, became quiet now. Waiters slowed their rounds. Conversations stalled at the bar. Guests who had been drifting toward the champagne tower drifted back toward the table. He examined the paper. He studied the pencil application under a loupe. He checked the signature. He cross-referenced the accompanying certificate against the Fenmore and Vance archive database on his tablet, a database accessible only to authenticated firm representatives. Colton said, "This is excessive." Franklin did not look up. After 3 minutes, which felt considerably longer, he straightened and addressed the room. "This piece is not an original work from Fenmore and Vance's founding archive. The sentence settled over the ballroom like something dropped from a height. The paper stock is inconsistent with the firm's documented archive materials from the period indicated. The signature does not match authenticated samples on file. The pencil technique in the lower portion of the image shows a working pattern inconsistent with the original designer's documented hand, and the certificate of authenticity uses a format the firm retired 11 years ago. He set the certificate carefully on the cloth beside the frame. The serial number on this document also appears in a set of fraudulent provenance papers submitted to the Ontario Art Authentication Board in 2019. Those papers were connected to a private dealer operating under several registered names. One of those names matches the dealer listed on the purchase receipt for this piece. Percival's wine glass came down on the nearest table, hard enough to make the guests beside him step back. My son acquired this through entirely legitimate channels. You have no standing to come into this room and… Then verification should be straightforward, Franklin said. It was not straightforward, and the room understood that without being told. Colton's posture had changed. The broad-shouldered assurance he had carried all evening had contracted into something smaller and harder to read. He looked at the framed piece. He looked at Orla. He looked at the faces nearest him and found no alliance in any of those places. Bryn had taken 4 steps toward the bar and was examining her champagne flute as though it required her complete and immediate attention. Orla, Colton said, lower now. This has gone far enough. You're embarrassing yourself. She looked at him. 10 years of looking at him across dinner tables and hospital corridors and the front seats of cars at odd hours, and it had always come back to this. Him waiting for her to make herself smaller, and her waiting for him to see past the size she had chosen to show. You brought her here, Orla said. The room did not pretend to misunderstand who she meant. Colton's jaw tightened. We'll discuss that privately. You announced our separation in front of 200 people, Orla said. I'd like the certificate reviewed. That is the only discussion I'm having tonight. Innes Marchand, who had been seated at a table near the east wall since the opening remarks, crossed the floor without hurrying and opened her leather folio on the edge of the authentication table. From this point forward, she said, directing the words to Colton and Percival equally, all communication regarding the separation, the marital estate, and any matters arising from this evening will be directed to my office. Colton turned on her. Who brings a solicitor to an anniversary dinner? Your wife? Innes said pleasantly. Franklin had continued working during the exchange. He looked up now and addressed Percival with the composed directness of a professional whose job required him to speak clearly in rooms that did not want to hear him. Mr. Whitfield. The serial number on this certificate also appears in documentation submitted to a commercial lending institution in support of asset valuations connected to Whitfield Capital. I can't draw legal conclusions from a ballroom table. That's not my role tonight. But I can tell you that the fraudulent certificate format was present in documents our firm forwarded to the Authentication Board 14 months ago, and that a complaint regarding related valuations was filed with the lending institution at approximately the same time. Percival's face moved through several expressions without settling on any of them. A murmur moved through the nearest tables. People who had been watching with the detached curiosity of spectators at an event that did not concern them had begun to understand that it concerned them after all. Orla stood without moving. She thought about 6 months earlier when Fenmore and Vance's commercial risk team had flagged an unusual discrepancy. Whitfield Capital had submitted documents referencing 2 Fenmore and Vance attributed artworks as collateral in a loan application. The pieces did not exist in any client record. Orla had instructed her team to preserve the documentation and hold it for review. She had quietly extended a line of trade credit through a Fenmore and Vance subsidiary contractor to a supplier connected to Whitfield Capital's development work, a legal, structured arrangement with documented terms enough to keep 2 of Percival's construction contracts from defaulting last autumn. Percival had never known. Colton had never known. She had done it because Colton still loved his father, and she had still loved Colton, and she had believed then that love required protecting the people your partner cared about, even when they didn't know they needed protecting. She understood now that she had been keeping a lie alive on behalf of people who were building more lies beneath her. I thought I was giving them time to find solid ground, she said quietly, to no one in particular. I didn't know I was giving them time to bury the problem deeper. Innes was already on her phone. Daly appeared at the side entrance with a sealed document folder and the composed expression of someone who had been waiting in the lobby since 7 o'clock for exactly this signal. Orla looked at the room, the untouched anniversary cake at the center table, the champagne tower, the white arrangements against the columns, and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "The party is over." No one disagreed. Guests collected their coats in small groups, speaking in low voices. The band did not. The cake remained where it stood. In a private meeting room off the east corridor, Ines laid out the next steps with the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment carefully and in advance. Franklin sealed the frame and certificate into separate evidence envelopes, labeled each one by hand, and signed them. Ines called Fenmore and Vance's risk division and confirmed the suspension of all trade credit extensions connected to Whitfield Capital's contractor network. She called the lender. She spoke without raising her voice. Colton knocked on the door once, then again. Ines opened it 6 inches. She explained, in the language of legal fact, that the building's security team had been informed of the situation and that his access to the private corridor was not authorized. Colton said something that was not quite a coherent sentence. Then he left. Orla sat in the quiet of the meeting room and let the weight of the evening reach her properly. She did not cry. The grief was there. She could feel it the way you feel a bruise before the color comes through, dull and patient and waiting for the right moment. The grief was not for the marriage's ending, which she had seen approaching from a long way off. It was for the version of Colton she had married, the one who had stood beside her in the rain outside an auction house in their first autumn together, holding an umbrella over her without being asked, telling her she looked like someone who carried too much alone. She had trusted that man. She had loved him in a way she had never felt the need to announce. She thought about him for a while, then she put him away. What followed in the weeks afterward did not arrive as drama. It arrived the way a Canadian January arrives, gradually, and then completely. Whitfield Capital's commercial lending arrangements were placed under formal review. The fraudulent certificates were submitted to the Ontario Art Authentication Board and forwarded to the relevant lender. A forensic accountant confirmed that 3 separate loan applications connected to Percival's holding company had used fabricated Fenmore and Vance provenance documentation to inflate the assessed value of collateral assets. 2 applications had been approved. The lender suspended Whitfield Capital's credit line before the month was out. Percival appeared at Fenmore and Vance's public reception desk 4 days later and demanded to speak with the executive leadership. The receptionist told him the firm was not receiving unscheduled visitors. He stood in the lobby for 11 minutes, then left. Colton's card was declined at a restaurant where he had been dining with former colleagues. He did not stay. He called Orla 14 times over 4 days. She did not answer. On the 5th day, he left a voicemail that began, "I didn't know what you were." That's not an excuse. He did not leave another one. Bryn Salas made her social media accounts private, withdrew from a charity board she had served on for 2 years, and declined a press interview that had been scheduled for the following month. She sent 2 messages to Colton that he did not reply to, and then she sent no more. None of this felt like victory to Orla. She had known it wouldn't. She had not prepared herself for triumph. She had prepared for the specific sadness of being correct about something she had very much wanted to be wrong about. 6 months after the anniversary dinner, Fenmore and Vance launched a new series of residential commissions called the Eloise series, named for Eloise Vance, Orla's mother, whose kitchen table sketches had given the firm its design language and whose pendant Orla still wore to every board review, every sign. Every morning she needed to remember what the work was actually for. The launch was held at the firm's Toronto headquarters. The room was spare and warm, lit by north-facing winter light. Eloise Vance's original sketches, the real ones, authenticated and archived, nothing counterfeit among them, were displayed on low tables behind glass, accompanied by brief handwritten notes from Orla about the work and the woman who had made it. At the room's center stood the sketch Colton had tried to present as a gift, not a reproduction. The original, pencil on kitchen table paper from 1999, signed in Eloise Vance's hand with the open loop of the V that no counterfeit had ever managed to replicate correctly because no counterfeit had ever loved the person whose habit it was. Daly stood beside Orla near the window as the room filled. "Are you ready?" Deal asked. Orla looked at the street below. Rain had started, fine and even, the kind of Toronto October rain that comes in from the lake and makes no particular announcement. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the weight of the frame in her hands and knowing within seconds that it was wrong. She thought about standing in rooms for 10 years and knowing what was wrong and waiting, past the point of reason, for love to correct it. She thought about Colton standing in the rain outside this building last month. She had seen him from her office window, standing across the street, looking up at a building he had spent a decade failing to ask about. She had watched him for a moment and then turned back to her desk. She touched her mother's pendant. She thought of Eloise at the kitchen table in Montreal, the pencil moving across paper in the afternoon light, coffee going cold between them, 12-year-old Orla doing homework across from her, and her mother looking up and saying, "Let them wonder about the quiet one, Orla. Let the work be the answer." She straightened. She walked out to the room. She did not speak about Colton, or Percival, or the anniversary dinner, or the woman who had stood in the Langford ballroom in an emerald dress preparing to step into a place she had fundamentally misunderstood. She spoke about her mother. She spoke about the firm Eloise Vance's talent had made possible, and the decade of deliberate, unannounced work that had built it into something that outlasted every person who had underestimated the woman behind it. She announced that a portion of the Eloise series proceeds would fund a grant program for women rebuilding financial and legal independence after coercive control in intimate relationships. She named it the Eloise Grant. The room was quiet for a moment, then it wasn't. Near the back, a young woman named Priscilla O'Heen, 26-year-old junior events coordinator on the firm's team, stood with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright. She had submitted a grant application 3 weeks earlier, quietly, without telling anyone at the firm. She had seen the listing posted internally, read it twice, and filled out the form in the way you reach for something you are not yet certain you deserve, carefully, and hoping no one was watching. Orla signed the final divorce papers the following morning, the prenuptial agreement held, the infidelity clause applied, Colton's public statements at the anniversary dinner, documented by the hotel's own security footage and by written accounts from 11 guests who submitted voluntary statements, were entered into the civil record. He retained no interest in any of Orla's premarital assets or the firm. He had sent his own solicitor to the signing. She had expected that and found it ultimately appropriate. "Did he say anything?" she asked Ines after. Ines considered the question with the honesty of someone who understood that precision mattered here. His solicitor conveyed that he was sorry, that he had underestimated you for a very long time. Orla looked at the signed page. She thought about all the ways that sentence had arrived a decade too late to be of any use, and all the ways it was still, despite everything, the most accurate thing Colton had ever said about their marriage. She pulled on her coat, picked up her bag, and took the lift down to the street. The city was cold and bright. She walked 2 blocks to the coffee shop she used every morning she was working in the city, ordered what she always ordered, and sat at the window table with a folder of acquisition proposals she had been meaning to review. The coffee cooled beside her. The street moved through its ordinary rhythms. Deliveries, dog walkers, people with their heads down against the October wind. No one looked twice at the woman in the grey wool coat with the small gold pendant, sitting at the window with a folder of papers, doing the work the way she had always done it, quietly, completely, and without needing anyone to notice first. She had built an empire her husband had spent 10 years praising at dinner parties without knowing. The woman, sitting across from him, had built every floor of it. She had hidden her crown because she wanted to know whether love could survive without it. It hadn't, but she had, and she was still here, and the work was still speaking. If this story reminded you that silence is not the same thing as surrender, subscribe to Broken Pledge Tales and leave Vance in the comments. For every woman who kept her head down, not because she had nothing to offer, but because she was waiting for exactly the right moment to let what she had built say everything that needed saying.